This is going to be a fun one. Let's talk about long-term and short-term memory. In order to understand how our brains work, how efficient learning happens, we need to understand these two topics. So, what are they? Well, long-term memory is stored in different regions of our brain. These memories are all over our brain in different spots. The way we create long-term memories is to create that memory and then continue to revisit it a few times in order to make that stronger and stronger connection in our neurons. We need to practice and repeat. Just like riding a bicycle, right? We learn to ride a bike by practicing it over and over. And although you might take 5 years in between riding a bike, you'll always know how to ride that bike because you've done it over and over and over. Long-term memory is formed by practicing and repeating. And long-term memory is extremely important when it comes to knowledge and learning because that's where you put fundamental concepts and principles that guide your life. When you learn something new in school, you usually use your long-term memory to remember things that you've learned in the past. Maybe basic math concepts, maybe geography, and using those concepts and principles to learn something new. These fundamental concepts and principles are stored in your long-term memory so that as we grow older, in an ideal situation, we're able to learn things better and faster and connect them to different parts of our brain. But how do we get this long-term memory in the first place, right? Well, we need to start off with short-term memory. And short-term memory is also sometimes called working memory. Although they're slightly different for our purposes, and working memory and short-term memory actually describe different processes, short-term memory and working memory usually involve our prefrontal cortex, so that is the front part of our brain. Unlike long-term memory, which is all over our brain, working memory and short-term memory is just involved in the front part of our brain. And scientists discovered that we can usually hold what we call 4 chunks of information when working with short-term memory. That's why when we need to go to the grocery store and somebody told us, hey, can you buy apples, carrots, oranges, and grapes? You have to repeat those in your mind to not forget. Or when you're given a phone number, it's often easy to remember 4 numbers, but any more than 4, it becomes difficult. For example, 4719. If you repeat that, you should be able to repeat it now. But if I gave you 81723056 and tell you to repeat that 1 minute from now, that second one is going to be a lot harder because our brain can hold usually just 4 chunks in short-term memory or working memory. But the connection between this short-term and long-term is important. You want to move this short-term memory to long-term memory. That's how long-term memories form. Initially, they're in the short-term, and then over repeated use, it gets stored in long-term memory. Now, you can do this using a technique called spaced repetition, which we're going to talk about a lot in this course. The idea is to repeat something over several days, which means doing something 20 times in one day is not going to be as good as doing something 20 times over 20 days. Each day doing that one thing once. That's why we don't want to cram for an exam. We want to do small things repeatedly over time. Remember when we learned about neurons and strengthening the connections of those neurons in our brain? That's the process of putting things into long-term memory. The more things you can connect a concept with, the more connections form, the stronger those connections form. Let's use an example. Let's say we want to learn about the god Ra, the god of sun when it comes to ancient Egyptians. How can you store Ra into long-term memory? Well, we now hold Ra into our short-term memory in one of our 4 chunks, but now we need to connect Ra and repeat the idea that is Ra into different parts of our brain. Now, we might revisit this page tomorrow and then the next day and then the next day until that memory sticks. But we can also connect it to different concepts that we have already in our brain, in our long-term memory. For example, Egypt and the god of Ra. How can we remember him? Well, you can associate it with that time that you went to Egypt to see the pyramids. Or maybe associated that time that you met somebody at Halloween who was wearing this exact skirt. Or maybe you remember that time that you had ramen and it was really, really hot. And that ramen kind of sounds like Ra. And Ra, sun, it's hot, ramen. You make those weird connections in your brain. And that's how you're going to remember Ra. And I guarantee you, by the end of this course, you're going to remember Ra as the god of sun because I just talked about hot ramen. So let's go back. We know that short-term memory is for something that you're currently working on. And when you need to bring long-term memory into something like working memory, you can sometimes solve problems that are currently in the working short-term memory by using the concepts and principles you learned that are stored in your long-term memory. So the process is often that the long-term memory, we use recall to recall some long-term memory, and then we use the short-term memory to consolidate and reconcile our knowledge. And then we practice and repeat over several days to add things into long-term memory. Just like we learned, our brain needs to be trained, and memory is just like a muscle. Our brain is a muscle that can be trained. Now, the sad thing is, as humans, we forget a lot of things that we learn over our lifetime. And research shows that within just 1 hour, if nothing is done with new information, that most people have forgotten about 50% of what they learned. After 24 hours, this amount increases to 70%. And if a week passes without that information being used, up to 90% of it could be lost. That's scary, right? So to improve knowledge acquisition and learning and retention, new information must be consolidated and securely stored in our long-term memory. You will notice that what we've learned up until now actually helps with this. The idea of sleep, of focus and diffuse mode, the idea of the Feynman technique to teach something, to check that you know it, to repeat it. The idea of spaced repetition, an important technique we'll discover in an upcoming video, all allow us to move from short-term memory to long-term memory so that we don't lose what we've just learned. I'll see you in the next one.